Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Welcome to our perspectives on justice in the Chauvin murder trial. We are just getting ready to begin. There's a few people are still being let into the webinar, but we will begin just momentarily here. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. My name's Sarah Davis. I'm honored to serve as the Executive Director of the Legal Rights Center. We're really grateful to have you here for this critical community conversation on justice in the context of this trial. The Legal Rights Center is a community nonprofit law firm in Minneapolis, founded in 1970 by the Black and Native American communities in Hennepin County, and later joined by immigrant communities as well. LRC continues to be led and operated as a community-driven organization, and it is our mission to work with our communities to seek justice and promote racial equity for those to whom it has been historically denied. Excuse me. Today's forum is part of our ongoing work focused on being responsive to community legal needs. We're now in the sentencing phase of Derek Chauvin's trial process. He's been convicted on all charges against him, and he will be sentenced next week. Some of the other pieces of our trial community support that you can learn more about on our website. We have been doing a lot of community education, both these forums as well as there's a lot of videos up on our site to share out information about the legal system. We are hosting a lot of restorative processing spaces, holding space and providing resources for folks in the community to process the trial in a facilitated and restorative way, and then providing legal support, ongoing legal support and education for protesters, making sure that members of our community know their rights and have access to necessary legal resources. With that, it's my honor to introduce you to our panelists for tonight's forum. Nekima Levy Armstrong is a civil rights attorney, activist, national expert on racial justice, former law professor and legal scholar. Nekima is the executive director of the Wayfinder Foundation and the founder of the Racial Justice Network. We're grateful to have Nekima here with us again this evening. Mary Moriarty is the former chief Hennepin County public defender and is on the faculty of public defender trial skills programs across the country. She teaches at Harvard Law School, trial advocacy workshop in the National Criminal Defense College, and she runs the criminal defense clinic at the University of Minnesota Law School. I don't know if Mary's rejoined us yet, but she will be back on. She was having a little bit of technical difficulty. Tonight, we're lucky to be joined for the first time by Bruce Nestor. He's an attorney in Minneapolis practicing in the areas of immigration, criminal defense, and post-conviction relief, focused on immigration consequences of criminal convictions. He represents people charged with crimes, both state and federal court. He's the past president of the National Lawyers Guild, which is the National Bar Association of Progressive Attorneys, Law Students, and Legal Workers, and was the first racially integrated bar association in the United States. He's also a past president of the Minnesota chapter of the National Lawyers Guild. And lastly, Andrew Gordon is LRC's Deputy Director for Community Legal Services. Andrew was born and raised in Kingston, Jamaica, and has dedicated his career to advocating for and empowering communities of color, immigrant communities, and other marginalized communities. He understands that there's nothing that separates him from the plight of his clients and their families. We're very lucky to have Andrew on our team at the Legal Rights Center. And so with that, let's get started. So we're going to start with a discussion on the sentencing, and I wonder, Nekima, if you could get us started. What do you think would be a just sentence for Derek Chauvin in this case? We know he's going to be sentenced next week.
On a personal level, I believe that life in prison without the possibility of parole would be a just sentence in this case. However, we know that for a second-degree murder conviction, that the presumptive sentence is about 12 and a half years. And due to aggravating factors, the judge could actually sentence him up to 30 years in prison. I don't think that that is enough. I would hope that Judge Cahill's sentences Derek Chauvin to the maximum amount of time in prison, but I believe that he will probably strike somewhere in the middle between the lowest and the highest possible sentence that he could have.
And I wonder if others could jump in. Maybe Mary or Andrew or Bruce, one of you might want to sort of just also help give a little bit perspective for our attendees this evening around what the law dictates around and how these aggravating factors work. Thanks for introducing that, Nekima. So I just invite you all to jump in.
I can jump in on the sentencing guidelines. So Minnesota is a guidelines state, and the top of the guidelines is 180 months, which would be 15 years. As Nekima said, the judge found aggravating factors, which probably allow him to depart up to 30 years. I had a chance to look at the sentencing memos filed by both the state and the defense. And I have to say that the defense motion asked for actually probation, but if probation was not in the cards, something less than less prison time. But one of the things that I noticed about the memo was that there was not a shred of empathy or remorse. And as a defense lawyer, of course, I realize when you've been convicted and you're trying to maintain your ability to appeal, there's some things you don't want to say. However, there were some things in this memo. For instance, one of the things the defense said was that Derek Chauvin was a product of a broken system. And usually when we see that, that has to do with our clients who have been the subject of trauma throughout their entire lives, but there doesn't seem to be anything like that in his background. One of the requests for a departure is justified by the defense in that he attended all of his appearances, he was properly dressed for court, and that he was deferential to the court. And I remember reading that thinking, so many of our clients, public defender clients, would like to have the opportunity to come to court on their own. And it's a lot easier to dress appropriately or dress in your own clothes when you're not held at the jail. And then the final thing was that they make it very clear in the defense memo that Chauvin doesn't think he did anything wrong at all. That he was simply in that, this is right from the memo, in good faith, relying on his training and experience. So I don't think this memo is going to land well with Judge Cahill. So I think that Chauvin may be looking at a sentence closer to 30 years. One thing I did want to throw out here, and I did this with a class I teach at the University of Minnesota, which actually has 8 students who are abolitionists. And I said, okay, my abolitionists, what do you think Chauvin's sentence should be? And they really struggled with that because they want to abolish prison. And ultimately where they landed was, we want to abolish prison, but after he's sentenced. So I wanted to throw out there, as a 31-year public defender, I have seen so many of my Black and brown clients go to prison when they shouldn't go to prison for a lot longer than anybody needed to go to prison. And at some point here, and I'm not saying with Chauvin, I have little empathy for him, but at some point here, we need to look at this system and figure out what other options we have on sentencing, restorative practices, for instance, on violent offenses, because what we know doesn't work. That what we're doing right now doesn't keep us safe. And so one thing I'd like people to keep in mind when we're having these conversations is, what does the system look like when we're talking about Black and brown clients, but we're also talking about a system that hasn't worked for them, and we have a white cop here. So I wanted to throw that out because sometimes it's hard to be consistent with our ideas about what we would like the system to be. And then somebody like Chauvin comes along who kind of challenges our ideas about what we want to see happen.
I wanted to pick up a little bit on Mary's points about reviewing the defense sentencing memorandum, because not only does he call it an error, he calls it an error made in good faith reliance on his own experience as a police officer and his training. And the very first time I saw that sentencing memo, the word broken system kind of stuck out at me. And I thought, well, let's see, how is that going to get developed? And yet it's not developed anywhere in the sentencing memorandum. And I struggle with the sentence. I hear Nekima about, you know, what you want and the need, particularly of oppressed communities, to have that and both emotional closure and a punishment directed against Derek Chauvin. But I also think 20 years from now, when he still has 10 or 20 years to serve, you know, we're going to have moved on in many ways. There's going to be other battles being fought. That's a long time. And I do believe that we want to try to move to eliminate prisons. I mean, it's beyond, I think, Derek Chauvin's capacity to do it, but it would almost be interesting if he really wanted to develop this broken system theme. If he would say, anytime I expressed empathy for someone I arrested, my fellow police officers talked me out of that the culture that we grow up in is one to brutalize and use force to gain immediate compliance from people. That, you know, when we heard of officers doing things and breaking the rules and breaking the law, we did nothing about it. We covered it up. If he almost became a voice from the inside and to try to explain his own conduct, not on him being a particularly depraved officer, but as being a product of the system, as someone who, you know, is now under indictment for doing to a 14-year-old largely what he did to George Floyd, but because it wasn't publicized on camera and it didn't result in death, nothing happened at the time, and it's only being prosecuted now. And so he has some capacity to be a voice from the inside of policing in the United States to talk about the reality of it. And in some sense, that really runs counter to the prosecution's narrative throughout the trial, which is that he was a bad cop in a good system. I don't think it's within him to really make that flip and to really expose and to talk about with empathy for the people that he policed for 19 years. But that's what I would like to see come out of any sort of restorative justice process, is he could be a truth teller about his behavior, what he saw, and what that means for the people that get policed in this country. I don't expect that, but I'm afraid that I think the system is really uniting prosecutors, judges, the judicial system, the business community, trying to restore our faith in the police and the criminal justice system, and trying to get us to back the police again after this profound, you know, disillusionment around Derek Chauvin, around the burning of the 3rd precinct, the uprising. And the best way for them to show that the system is working and restoring itself is to give him a very long sentence. So I agree that that's personally something I look forward to, but I'm also conflicted about it. And I would wish that Derek Chauvin somehow had the capacity to be a truth teller about the reality of policing that he practiced and has seen from his fellow officers for so many years. But I don't think Nekima expects that.
I want to invite Andrew into the conversation, and also welcome Nekima back into the conversation, because folks have responded to your initial statement here. So Andrew, jump in.
Yeah, sure. So I think Nekima, Mary, and Bruce have said a lot of stuff that I would maybe echo and follow up on, right? Some hard numbers. The state is asking for 360 months in this case, which is double the upper end of the presumptive commit in this case. So 180 times 2, 360 months. I would imagine that's likely the actual sentence we're going to see from Cahill, or something very close, if only because, as Mary and Bruce have already pointed out, the defense's position with respect to sentencing seems absurd. There's no remorse. There's talk. There are a lot of platitudes in the defense motion resentencing, but not a lot of real substance. And if I know Cahill any at all, he's not going to respond well to that. And I think Mary also alluded to that. I think the discussion we're having about whether or not a sentence here feels like justice, whether or not it is in line with maybe folks on this panel and folks elsewhere who are generally abolitionists in their nature, I think really is simply an indictment of the limited tools that the system affords us once folks enter the criminal legal system, right? Once Derek Chauvin was charged and went to trial and was convicted, the court really doesn't have much that it can do but to sentence him in a case like this to prison, right? There is not much scope for creativity. There's not much scope for thinking outside the box when we get to this point in the proceedings. And I think, you know, there are a lot of people who like the system as it's designed that way. And there are folks who are trying to fight against that. It would be really interesting. I think, for example, if let's say Derek Chauvin was as Bruce wanted him to be, right? Which is that he came out of this process and said, you know what, that's messed up. Let's talk about the broken system that produced me. Let's shine a light on it, and let's talk about the ways we can be restorative in this process, right? You can imagine a scenario where in that case, you're having conversations now with George Floyd's family, with other individuals who have been directly impacted by Derek Chauvin himself, as well as the Minneapolis Police Department, and that there is some hint, some direction, some movement towards a restorative process that is not purely carceral, it's not purely based in punishment. We don't have that process though, right? And I think that's what we're lacking in terms of the court and the criminal legal system really being able to think outside the box and to redefine what it means for justice to come out of a proceeding and a process like this, right? And I think the last thing I'll say, it's really difficult, I think, to take anything at face value in the defense motion requesting a departure, both a disposition and durational departure, when we had during the closing argument, the prosecutors getting up there and saying that this was a pro-police prosecution. It's very difficult to square that sentiment with then Derek Chauvin saying he's a product of a broken system, but not elaborating on it and really not participating in the process. But I'll leave my comments at that. I am looking forward to the conversation tonight.
Sarah, is it okay for me to respond? I love my fellow co-panelists, fellow lawyers, but I feel that you guys are living in la-la land. If we're talking restorative justice before we talk accountability. Our community, as the Black community, is nowhere near talking about restorative justice in a case in which we watched a Black man be lynched in broad daylight and aided and abetted by 3 other officers who not only, according to the federal indictment against them, failed to intervene, they actually contributed to George Floyd being killed. So I would have even changed that wording in the indictment and made them equally responsible for their role in helping to either hold George Floyd's body down and apply pressure, or to physically deny people the opportunity to intervene, which might have saved George Floyd's life. So I think we have a long way to go before we can talk restorative justice in this situation, because of the fact that people are still grieving, they're still traumatized, and we know that people are still being killed by the police. So even though I know there's a lot of people who claim to be abolitionists, we're not there as a society for a variety of reasons. I think about the Charleston church shooter, the young man, Dylan Roof, I believe is his name, who went into the Black church, killed 9 people, was given a bulletproof vest and fed Burger King. I think about Kyle Rittenhouse, who shot protesters in Kenosha, Wisconsin, after Jacob Blake was shot in the back multiple times and is paralyzed. And the protests surrounding his near murder resulted in people, of course, taken to the streets, but also white supremacists like this young man showing up, shooting people and killing a person, and being able to walk out with his hands up scot-free and escape to a whole other jurisdiction. So to think about abolition, to think about restorative justice at a moment like this is very difficult and far removed from the reality of our thinking as many Black people in Minnesota and across this country. And the reality is that when we look at our prison systems, they're filled with Black and brown people who will never get the opportunity for restorative justice or truth-telling, who will never see the light of day. And there are people who have been sentenced to life in prison, not just for not killing someone, but for something like being involved in a drug trafficking ring being on the lower end of that ring and being sentenced to 25, 30, 40 years life in prison, away from their families and communities for a nonviolent offense. So it's very difficult for me to take a conversation about restorative justice and about abolition seriously at a time when most cops are not prosecuted when they kill people, even when it's caught on video. So we haven't even moved to that phase of saying, oh, after Chauvin, let's shut down the prison system. And I know it's theoretical, but think about all of the police officers who have killed people, and there has been zero accountability. And we're saying, close the prison doors after we've locked up millions of people, particularly people of color, poor white folks, and people with mental health issues. So I think we have to make sure we're being sensitive and grounded in reality when we're having these conversations as we envision and reimagine a brighter future with regard to how we deal with situations where people have taken multiple lives, when they've been serial killers, when they've, I mean, what are people going to do with individuals like that? Now, what I think should happen, and of course, I would love for you all to weigh in on this, but what I think should happen is that prison should be reserved for the most serious offenders in our society so that they can get help, treatment, rehabilitation. But I personally don't want a serial killer back out on the street because of someone's vision of closing the prison doors. I want them locked away so they can't continue to kill people. I don't want those child murderers walking around, you know, after doing restorative justice and being back out on the street because people are saying we need to focus on abolition. So all those thoughts are going through my mind as I look at what's happening right now to people of color and poor people in the system. And the fact that I don't feel that we're working aggressively enough to dismantle the current system in a way that is equitable, that focuses on their human dignity, and that opens the prison doors for those right now who do not belong there. But Chauvin definitely belongs there, and he belongs there for life.
And Nekima, just to show, I am actually not living in La La Land. I started thinking about this actually when Noor was prosecuted, where he was treated more like our clients than most people I had seen in terms of bail. He was completely overcharged, and then he went to prison for a really long period of time. And of course, that was the first time a police officer had been accountable, and he was Black and the victim was white. I mean, in terms of Chauvin, he's going to get a long sentence. I think that that's appropriate. But I do think for people who particularly tune in to hear this, it's a good time to be thinking about the future and thinking about all the Black and brown people who are in prison on lengthy sentences, and the fact that we can have alternatives to that, where we don't have to treat like an officer Noor the way we treat every other Black and brown person. And so that's what I was trying to get at, not that I thought that that was appropriate for Chauvin.
Well, and I just want to thank y'all for this conversation. And Bruce, I'll have you jump in here in a minute. I try to restrain myself because we have 4 really qualified panelists, but as somebody who's practiced, a deeply experienced restorative practitioner and advocated for integration of restorative practices throughout my career, I just want to say I absolutely support a transformation of our criminal legal system to one that is a community system of justice grounded in restorative practices. And to do it in the context of Derek Chauvin, in many ways centers whiteness in that, right? And we really need to be mindful about thinking about, so, you know, for folks who are actually really interested in what this could look like and what it might look like to transform and return power to community using restorative practices and have better outcomes, I just really encourage you to check out the work that we're doing at the Legal Rights Center as it relates to that, because it's really centered on the experiences of Black and brown communities and the indigenous practices. So I just jump in to say that. Bruce, I'll pass it over to you to continue the conversation.
Just very briefly, I just think we can have contradictory thoughts in our mind at the same time. In other words, we can believe in emptying the prisons of the Black and brown bodies that are there now and believe that Derek Chauvin should go to prison. We can believe in abolitionism, we're moving towards that, and still believe that in this system at this time, the right thing is for Derek Chauvin to go to prison. And so we can have some contradictory ideas and a lot of debate about that. But I really think that what Sarah and what Nekima said before that is we have to understand, the impact that Derek Chauvin's case and what we saw him do, and what he did and what he has been allowed to do, the impact that has on particular communities, and that we can't sit up as a position of professionals and somehow impose an ideological constraint on what should happen to Derek Chauvin. The demand of the community was clear. The crowds were marching in the streets, prosecute the police. That's the demand when they commit injustice. And when they get prosecuted and they get convicted, they get locked up. At the same time, we can demand changes to the prison system and how the vast majority of the people cycled through the criminal and justice system are being treated.
I wonder if I could also just invite, we're getting some questions just related to sort of how the sentencing process might look, like what the hearing might look like, how a victim or an impact statement might play out. And so I wonder if folks could chime in on those types of questions, what folks can expect from the hearing next week. And then also how you might expect it to look different. So, again, most of the people who are sentenced in our criminal legal system are not white police officers. So how do you expect that this might look different, and what are you watching for?
The way sentencings typically go is, we know both sides have submitted sentencing memos. We know that the probation officer also wrote a recommendation, which I'm pretty sure didn't recommend anything different than prison. Otherwise, the defense would have put that in their memo. I would expect to see is that there will be victim input, which is always really, really difficult to listen to. And what victim input is that family members, friends can come in and they can make a statement, but it's important to know that they can only make that statement to the judge. They are not allowed to speak to Chauvin. And if they forget, as sometimes people do, they'll be directed to make their statement to the judge. And so he will hear all of that. I do think Judge Cahill has his mind made up and knows what the sentence is going to be, but he will listen to what victim impact, what people have to say about how this impacted their lives. The lawyers will have an opportunity to speak, even though they've put their thoughts extensively in writing, but we will hear from both of them. And then the issue that's really up in the air, but I think we may know the answer to that, is whether Chauvin's going to speak. Anyone who's being sentenced has what's called a right to allocution, meaning they have a right to speak to the judge, but they don't have to. It would be a good opportunity for Chauvin to express some remorse, apologize, do something that wouldn't actually jeopardize his potential appeal, but express some remorse towards the family. And given what we saw in that defense motion, I would guess at this time we're not going to hear from him at all. But that's typically how sentences go. Judge Cahill will sentence him, and then he'll be taken away, and that'll be it.
And Andrew or Bruce, I wonder if you want to just jump in on how you expect things might look different or what you're expecting.
I would agree with what Mary just said. The most interesting part for me might well be allocution and whether Derek Chauvin chooses to speak. I suppose one reality is that he probably and his lawyer very much also feel that the sentence has largely been determined, that Judge Cahill has made up his mind. And so there's a great maybe desire for some apology or some expression of remorse, but it's not really going to be of any benefit to Derek Chauvin. We may not get that. I'm struck, and this is just reading into it, but his body language as he murdered George Floyd, his body language watching him in court. I don't see a lot of remorse or introspection about what he did or his role as a police officer. And in that sentencing memorandum, although written by his attorney, I think it has to reflect he thinks that what he did was normal, in accordance with his training, and justified, and that he's being strung up as a scapegoat because of public demands in order to and that's just what I just don't expect him to speak, I guess. But that kind of is it would be the most kind of the emotional highlight beyond the victim's impact statements of the sentencing.
Nekima, before we move on from sentencing, I wonder if you could, or Andrew could jump in as well, but what do you expect the community's response to be? And, what do you expect when we get to the day of sentencing in that time?
I think that there will be some anxiety and tension around his sentencing and whether or not he is going to be held fully accountable under the law. When you look through the lens of how many African Americans view our criminal injustice system, as Bruce called it, they're looking at it from, typically speaking, from the context of seeing Black and brown people brought into the system under much less serious circumstances and facing typically very long sentences, especially in the federal system as well. So that's how people are going to be looking at it in terms of fairness, not to mention the message that the community would like to see being sent to police officers in terms of what accountability looks like when you commit an egregious harm against a person in the community, and making sure, I think 12 and a half years, 15 years would be seen as a slap on the wrist for Derek Chauvin, and people want, generally speaking, the maximum punishment available. Some people think 30 years is not enough for what he did, and the fact that this wasn't, although this was the first time he's been prosecuted, this is really not his first time engaging in extreme abuse of residents of Minneapolis, including the 14-year-old who was part of a separate federal indictment. That's part of why Derek Chauvin thinks that this behavior is so normal. He's gotten away with it for so long. And then the Black woman, Zoya Code, who he also did this to, who is still experiencing trauma as a result of Derek Chauvin's knee on her neck. And those are just the ones we know about, right? And the people who are part of that New York Times expose about Derek Chauvin's behavior, but there's many more who probably didn't file a report and that we don't know about, that he is victimized and brutalized. And although the court might not take those other things into account, as a community, we are paying attention. And to that, in that regard, he is a part of a broken system, in the sense that they allowed him to get away with these egregious harms for so long. But he benefited from that broken system, still collecting a pension, a paycheck. I mean, I don't know if he's collecting a pension now, but a paycheck, health benefits, and other benefits, including his authority under the law, and knowing that he wasn't going to be disciplined or held accountable. So he benefited, from the participation in that broken system, and then now turn it around and try to use it as leverage to lessen his culpability is absolutely absurd.
Bruce, can I ask you to jump in on a really specific question here as it relates to how is the federal prosecution impact, Nekima's referenced that the federal indictment, how do you expect that will impact?
I think that's really a complex question. It's an unusual circumstance where someone is convicted in state court of this serious an offense and is facing a prosecution in federal court still. And as Nekima said, an entirely separate indictment and separate prosecution for a different victim on a different occasion, when there's body cam video out now of him doing that to this 14-year-old, very similar behavior. And so I don't know. And there's, of course, we have the prosecutors in the federal system. You also have Derek Chauvin and his defense attorney in the other cases. And there's a lot of conversation, a lot of talking going on right now as to how they're going to resolve this situation. There's, a trial was very difficult for the prosecution. It's very difficult again for Derek Chauvin to think of him going through that process and having it turn out better. Given the way it turned out the first time in the evidence. The reality is that I would think that at least for the prosecution, the indictment related to George Floyd, assuming he receives a 30-year or something sentence in state court, I don't know that a federal prosecution would result in any more time. Is that something that he wants to bargain, something to get something by agreeing to plead guilty in federal court? Or what do the prosecutors want out of it? I just think there's a lot of unresolved questions. I do think, it's worth keeping in mind, the word broken system is one people often use for immigration. It's broken because it doesn't serve immigrants, but it's really not broken. It serves a purpose of keeping immigrants fearful of a low-wage workforce. In many ways, the criminal justice system, policing system isn't broken. It's serving the purpose that was intended to break up, to fracture communities of color, to serve as a replacement for mechanisms of repression in the past when explicit legal, racism was legally justified. And so the system works the way it's supposed to with its brutality, and it's locking people up, and it's keeping us divided and keeping people oppressed. And so in the federal indictment, I think, is part of that same system to try to send us a message, well, the system is working. We're holding officers accountable, even though we're in a system that for 19 years relied on the testimony of Derek Chauvin in trials and court hearings to convict and send people to prison. And if we had changed that system, if we had the changes that are being demanded, I would feel much more comfortable with the federal prosecution being a real and a positive step, as opposed to something designed to keep the system functioning and to keep those changes from happening that we think need to happen in the system as a whole.
Andrew, I wonder if you could jump in. There's been a couple questions about just where would Derek Chauvin serve his sentence, and do we think whatever sentence comes out of this might set a precedent for future police officers who were charged or convicted. So before we move on, I just want to quick get those questions answered.
Yeah, I don't necessarily know that I have great answers for those questions because I saw them coming as well. For the question regarding precedent, I think that's going to be, if I were Eric Nelson and I were Derek Chauvin, I would think that would be part of the concern. I guess not even necessarily Eric Nelson, but maybe some of the other attorneys representing the other officers, especially in this particular case. If I was Kim Potter's attorney, I would certainly be concerned. On the other hand, right, and I think as you've heard from Nekima, you've heard from Bruce, you've heard this from Mary as well, is that I think if the court were being truly responsive to what the community demand is for what a potential sentence could look like, the potential of 360 months in prison seems a whole lot less than what the community would be asking Judge Cahill or other judges in Hennepin County with respect to Kim Potter, etc., to actually serve in prison, right? And so to the extent that there is, I think, precedential value in what a prospective sentence for Derek Chauvin is, I think you will see other defense attorneys, and I think you would see other similarly situated officers argue that they may be different than Derek Chauvin. Their crimes, the reason they're in court, those things are just less egregious, right? You could already see Kim Potter's attorney making that argument in the precedent filings that have already been made in court. Kim Potter is not Derek Chauvin. Kim Potter doesn't deserve to be treated that way, right? And you already see that reflective in what she's been charged with vis-a-vis what Derek Chauvin was ultimately charged and convicted with, right? And so, in short, I don't know. I don't personally know, because I think there are going to be a lot of different factors that could impact a potential sentence for other officers in similar situations. Simply put, is there going to be video of the offense, right? We had Winston Smith gunned down and murdered in Uptown, a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago. And we're being told that there's no body camera. We were told initially he was a murder suspect, and you can see how that helped shape the narrative, right? Even though what probably happened to him could have been maybe worse than what happened to George Floyd, given the number of shots, given the number of officers, given the circumstances that he was in. So if the question is, you know, is it going to be presidential? I don't know. I honestly don't know. And so I'm curious as to whether Nekima, Mary, or Bruce have any comments on that as well.
I will say, I think part of the federal indictment might be to try to entice Chauvin to plead guilty so he can serve his time in federal prison. And as part of an agreement, they could agree that he would not appeal that sentence. And so a benefit to the state would be they wouldn't have to worry about the appellate sentence in state court, although I'm not convinced that they need to be worried about that. But they also wouldn't have to put those community members through the trauma of testifying at trial, as well as the community itself. So there is something on both sides there to be gained. And so that's why I have some thought that the federal indictments, at least with respect to Chauvin, will be resolved. In terms of precedent, it's less sentence that I look at as what's going to happen with these prosecutions. This was a prosecution of a kind we've never seen before. This went to the Attorney General's office. There were something like 12 or more lawyers who worked on this case. They had some of the best experts I have ever seen testify. And as you know, Andrew's pointed out, there was a video and there was 9.5 minutes where Chauvin had an opportunity to do something different. What we typically see are these cases where a police officer makes some kind of split-second decision, gets on the stand, if they are indeed charged, and says, I was afraid for my life. And then the law is not very good on that. The instructions given to jurors aren't very good at that. I think we need to have some changes in the law where police officers are not allowed to create the situations that they then claim they're afraid of. So we have some legal changes that it would be nice if we could get from the legislature. So I worry more about the actual, what kind of precedent is this? I mean, it's very good that people in the community could see that a white officer could be held accountable for killing a Black man. But what does this mean for the future in terms of actually prosecuting police officers and obtaining convictions? I'm not sure yet.
I would have to agree that it is unclear how this prosecution will impact other police officers being held accountable, although I believe that before George Floyd, we wouldn't have seen Kim Potter be charged at all for what she did to Daunte Wright. So that is one example of that. And I get alerts every day from here and around the country when there's police-involved shootings, police-related incidences. In most of those alerts over the past year, they have mentioned since the since the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And these are in places around the country, regardless of the circumstances, most of them mention what happened to George Floyd. So I think that there's some value in that in terms of the recognition of what happened. And as you said, Mary, we did see a stellar prosecution, outstanding witnesses. The trial was televised, the world was watching, the world took to the streets. All of those things were very different. But I also want to remind people that if the case had stayed in the hands of County Attorney Mike Freeman, I believe that Derek Chauvin would not have been convicted, even with the bystander video, even with the world taken to the streets, even with all the information, that there might not have been a conviction. Remember Mike Freeman's original pleadings, that he filed his complaint that he filed, which we thought was legally deficient, inappropriate, et cetera. That gave some insight into how they might have tried that case to actually throw it. So that's what I have to remind people, like, we saw something very unique, and part of it had to do with the office that it was in and the seriousness with which they undertook the case and how it drew resources that typically are not connected to a prosecution of a police officer. And so that is why we have continued to apply pressure to Governor Walz to establish an office of the independent special prosecutor to review, evaluate, and investigate all cases in which police officers have killed people, and even reopening previous cases that never got the attention that they deserved. That to me needs to be a part of our process. And we also need to be more proactive about something that one of you mentioned earlier, which is the fact that Derek Chauvin testified in court. How many people did he send to prison off of false or misleading testimony, planted evidence, etc.? Those folks are not getting a second chance. They're not even getting restorative justice. They're still sitting there while they would watch and wait for the fate of a person who participated in them losing their freedom.
Thanks, Nekima, and thanks all for that really robust discussion on the sentencing for Derek Chauvin. You know, there's been a lot of conversation throughout this just now about what does this mean for future prosecutions, and I wonder if we could move to talk a little bit about the upcoming trials that have now been moved. I believe, is it March of next year, for the other three officers who face the same charges as Derek Chauvin in state court, but are charged under aiding and abetting liability. So I wonder, you know, what folks are thinking as we lead up to that, you know, how Derek Chauvin's trial might impact the way that all plays out. And, you know, just invite you to jump in on that.
Well, I'd say particularly for Officer Tao, things did not look good. He's the one person I think things looked a lot worse for in the Chauvin trial. Lane, you know, there were also, you know, you ask yourself why, when they were investigating an alleged fake $20 bill, is he approaching the side of George Floyd's car with his gun drawn, pointed at his head, and swearing profanity at him? And he was brand new to the job. You know, where did that come from? So in looking at the federal indictments, they're actually not all indicted on the same thing. And I noticed that Lane was not indicted on count 2, which was essentially violating George Floyd's constitutional rights in unreasonable seizure. What Lane has been charged with, along with the other former officers, is that they violated George Floyd's constitutional rights by failing to render aid, which I think would be a lot easier to prove, I would imagine. And so I think certainly those indictments might also be meant to send a signal that you are looking at a lot of time in federal court, in state court, because I don't think people understand when you're charged with aiding and abetting, you are actually looking at exactly the same sentence as the principal, as Chauvin. So they may have been indicted federally to try to coerce a plea out of them as well, to try to avoid a state court trial. And as Bruce mentioned earlier, there are, I'm sure, a lot of discussions going on behind the scenes. And that we don't know what they're talking about, but it may very well be that we won't see any other trials if they're able to wrap this up in some kind of global resolution.
Bruce, Andrew, or Nekima, any thoughts you want to jump in on?
Yeah, if the question is kind of the impact on the later trials, I think I've mentioned in a similar forum to this, maybe on the last time we were all together, that my honest expectation is that those cases are not going to go to trial. Much like Mary just said, I have to imagine that there are fairly intense negotiations going on behind the scenes, negotiations that will likely pick up steam once the sentencing order from Cahill is printed and filed in court, right? So once Derek Chauvin formally starts this prison sentence that he is almost assuredly going to get. I think there are lots of reasons for that, including the fact that I think the state and the prosecution of those cases has a vested interest in not necessarily re-traumatizing a lot of the same witnesses who would then have to go back and testify again. And frankly, because I think those cops and those former law enforcement officers are in a position where they're now looking directly at the sentence that Derek Chauvin get, and I don't know that they're necessarily going to want to tempt fate to get similar sentences. But that's just my personal opinion, and that's what I would expect to go. Just real quick before I turn it over to Nekima and Bruce for any responses, I just as a follow-up to what Nekima and Bruce mentioned last time, I put something in the chat with respect to Derek Chauvin. Since 2004, he had testified in 35 cases. That's information directly from MPD in the city of Minneapolis, because some of us, you're right, are working on that issue, right? And so that's where that information is coming from. It is not a complete list, I can tell you that much, but I can tell you at least 35 cases.
I just wanted to, briefly point out Mary's reference to that initial approach of the officer to George Floyd over the $20, the allegation of a $20 bill, gun drawn, profanity. I mean, that if you watch body camera video of the Minneapolis Police Department, that's the type of interaction and abuse that you see directed towards suspects of color, poor people, certain communities, certain areas of the city, just on an absolutely routine basis. Prosecutors see it, judges see it, nothing's done about it. That's the way the system is supposed to work, and that's what is, you guess that's what people are picking up in law enforcement academy and training school and on the job as to how they're supposed to behave, regardless of what's printed on the side of the squad car.
I'm going to push back on that a little bit, Bruce, not on the part that we see that every day, but the part that that's the way it's supposed to work. And I'm a strong advocate that prosecutors and judges can play a major role in police accountability. So for instance, when we all see body cam where that kind of thing is happening, prosecutors are seeing that. What are they doing about it? Are they refusing to charge those cases? Are they calling up the police chief and saying, hey, this is a violation of your policy, you've got to do something about this? So I think as a piece of police accountability, prosecutors can play a huge role. They just aren't really playing much of a role, at least with respect to the county attorney's office right now. And we know that they've said that they feel that they're not the employer of police officers. But that is one area where the system should work a lot better, where the people who are seeing body cam are taking it to the appropriate people or taking actions to make sure these cops can't testify if they are going to act in or engage in that kind of behavior.
I agree in theory with what Mary is saying, but I took Bruce's comments in terms of focusing more on the roots of the system, particularly looking at what happened after the passage of the 13th Amendment, where the criminal legal system, criminal and justice system was supposed to, in some ways, in many ways, be an extension of slavery. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall be allowed except if one has been duly convicted of a crime. And we saw what happened in southern states where they changed the laws on the books to make standard behavior by Black men in particular a crime, brought them into the system knowing that they would have to spend many years away from their families and community, work for free, sometimes under extremely dangerous conditions, and the state would profit off of the labor of those who were incarcerated. And so we still see that happening today. Major corporations having incarcerated people package their products, prison stocks being traded on Wall Street, even institutions of higher ed investing in prisons. So that was more of where, at least I was perceiving Bruce's comments in terms of the design of the system being put in place to produce the kinds of results that we're seeing. So we're constantly in a battle trying to fix something that was designed to have the exact results that are impacting our community. And correct me if I'm wrong, Bruce, but that was.
No, I think you said what I was trying to say and said it better.
Well, thank you all for jumping in on that. I just to pick up on what was talked about a little bit earlier as it relates to the sentencing or what we can expect for these other three officers. It's clear that everybody thinks that there's probably negotiations happening right now that could lead to plea agreements. But Mary made a point earlier that I think we really just need to re-emphasize for folks, and I wonder if someone could just talk a little bit about this, that I think there's a misunderstanding that folks have that because the other officers were charged with aiding and abetting, they're somehow held to, if they were convicted, that they would face a lesser sentence. And, wondering if we could just talk about what does it mean to aid and abet? What does that accomplice liability mean? And just to re-emphasize that point on accountability for that.
Yeah, it's been interesting to hear Lane's lawyer talk about how he's not guilty. And he uses the example of, what did you expect a brand new officer to do? Go push Chauvin off. And the truth is that the law does not expect you to do that. In fact, the law does not require you to intervene. Certainly, MPD policy requires you to intervene. And if you don't, you can lose your job. But the law, you can just stand there as long as you're not aiding and participating in some way. So if I were to look at this case, I would look at Tao as, let's say 3 people are beating up on somebody and there are people who are trying to come and help. And Tao is kind of a lookout bodyguard guy preventing people from helping. By his own actions, he is aiding in the accomplishment of this crime. In terms of Lane had his hands on George Floyd and was in some respect holding him down. Now, a couple of times he says, should we roll him over? And that could kind of cut both ways. He certainly knew better. He knew that George Floyd was in a position that was dangerous, and yet he didn't do anything about it. But not only did he not do anything about it, he didn't take his hands off and step away. I believe if he had taken his hands off and stepped away, he would not be charged. But he certainly wasn't required to go push Chauvin off. You were simply responsible for your own actions. And what the law says about sentencing is that if you are convicted of aiding and abetting, you are looking at exactly the same sentence. And we know that the Attorney General's office is trying to get aggravating factors on the other 3 former officers as well. Now, it's certainly up to the judge to decide whether anybody played a lesser role than, say, Chauvin, but that's rolling the dice. That's not guaranteed. So right now they are looking at exactly the same sentences as Chauvin is looking at if they are convicted.
Before we move on from talking about these 3 officers, I wonder if we could just pick up on something that actually we talked about in a prior forum, which was this concept that the prosecution created this in Derek Chauvin's trial. They created this pro-police prosecution. They created this world in which Derek Chauvin was a bad cop in a good system, right? And I think we've talked about that a bit here too. Derek Chauvin put in his sentencing memo, it's a broken system. His attorney, in my opinion, didn't do a particularly good job of establishing that on a factual basis in the trial. But I wonder how you see that playing out in should these cases go to trial, and with these other 3 officers, going back to Nekima and Bruce's point earlier about this is a system doing exactly what it was designed to do, and Mary talking about prosecutors holding police accountable. But in many ways, what the prosecution did here in holding Derek Chauvin accountable was to relieve the rest of the system of accountability. And so I wonder if we could just briefly talk about that in the context of these upcoming cases and other police accountability cases.
I just think, that's the main ideological battle going on in our city right now. I think around public safety and law enforcement is the effort of so many parts of the existing power structure to try to restore the authority of the police, to try to restore the idea of policing as an effective system to produce public safety. And so the sentencing process, the charging of the other officers is all going to be part of that and try to feed into that. And I think it's incumbent upon us to, as a movement and as people both in the streets and talking about the changes in the legal system, to keep in mind that what the changes that we need are in the system as a whole, not just to demand particular sentences, for these upcoming in these upcoming trials, or resolutions of their cases, because I tend to agree with what Andrew said, that there's a good chance they won't be proceeding to trial.
Go ahead,
I
Andrew.
had it in, oh, Nekima, go ahead.
Oh, no, I thought Andrew wanted to say something.
No, go for it, Mary.
Okay. I had an interesting experience on a panel where a woman asked me about why didn't the prosecution call out the behavior of the EMTs, which was interesting because we now know that George Floyd was in full cardiac arrest when he was on the ground. We know that every minute that goes by that he is not receiving chest compressions, the chance of him coming back gets less and less. So she was pointing out, why, and she actually did file a complaint, I think, with Hennepin Health about it. And it was told that they did what we've heard, a load and go. And apparently that was because of some perceived fear or something of the crowd, which is an interesting, I mean, it was part of the defense, of course, of Derek Chauvin, that there was something scary about a 9-year-old girl and other people standing there trying to urge them to help George Floyd. But that was also an interesting thing. What is EMT doing? And when she asked me that question, I said, I think probably strategically, rather than saying EMT shouldn't have done that and the cops shouldn't have done that. It would have been a harder case if you are taking on everybody. And so strategically, that was probably the most effective way to get a conviction there. But having said that, I think it is really important to start thinking about issues like that. If you know the seconds are ticking away, why isn't EMT starting compressions right away? What is it that we need to do to get police and EMT and whoever else to stop looking at people who are in neighborhoods of color as being somehow dangerous and changing their behavior in a way that it could be extremely damaging in loss of life?
Thanks, Mary. And Andrew and Nekima, I just wanted to give you a chance to weigh in before we move on from this conversation. Welcome.
I'll give Nekima a chance to get settled again. I honestly don't know that I have much to add following kind of Bruce's lead-off comment, because I think he's absolutely right that when we talk about the incentives that are present for the system to effectively show off that it is working, I think you see plenty of evidence in Chauvin's case and maybe in some of the other cases that that's exactly what's occurring, right? And so to the extent that the system benefits from quote unquote holding Derek Chauvin and his officers accountable, I think you will likely see that it will do what is necessary to be able to wave that particular flag. So whether it's, a fairly lengthy, even if it's not long enough, a prison sentence for Derek Chauvin, whether it is aiding in the resolution of the later cases such that those officers once again are, quote unquote, held accountable, or similar, resolutions in the Kim Potter case for the murder of Dante Wright. I think the system is going to do what the system does because the system is very good at protecting itself. It's done that and perpetuated that particular myth for a very long time. And so I said I didn't have a lot to say post Bruce's comment, and I'm going to end there. I'm going to turn it over to Nekima now.
Well, I think just a couple things. One, they honestly almost had no choice but to put Derek Chauvin on trial and not the system, primarily because they're looking at a diverse jury, some of which included white people and other folks who may not have ever had negative experiences with police, who may still believe in police being there to protect and serve, who probably reject the demonstrations or who are annoyed by them, and who want to continue to believe in the system. And so they knew when they were choosing that jury that multiple prospective jurors and those who are ultimately chosen had relationships with law enforcement, either being related to them or being close friends with them, and that they were likely not going to be willing to vote against what they may perceive their own interests as being in terms of protecting what we have in place. And we've seen this play out in the community as well, especially recently in our community, where we have seen a surge in violence happening, where we have experienced 3 young children who have been shot in the community through stray bullets, people being reckless or targeting other folks. 2 of those children have died, an 8-year-old named Trinity and a 6-year-old named Anaya. LaDavion is 10 years old. He's still in the hospital fighting for his life. And so in press conferences and out at vigils, we've heard people talk about how we need more police, or how all these police aren't Derek Chauvin, you know, and so that messaging is resonating with folks who are concerned about crime. I don't agree with that messaging, but I know that that is something that's being used to try to protect the system, even within community, because people want to feel safe. They want something to believe in order to feel safe when things are happening in their community, as well as someone to blame. And so unfortunately, a lot of the blame goes to not the people who create and maintain and perpetuate these systems, but to those who are raising concerns about the system. In terms of EMTs, I do believe that that is an area that is ripe for evaluation and discussion, because it goes back to what happened to Jamar Clark, how he was standing at the back of an ambulance on November 15th of 2015, checking on a friend who was injured. And the EMTs apparently called the police and said Jamar Clark was belligerent. Something happened in that exchange that led to the police responding, making the decision to respond aggressively to Jamar Clark. And within 61 seconds of the police coming on the scene, he was dead. And we did not, shot in the head at point blank range. We didn't see the EMTs step forward and provide a different narrative from those police officers who killed Jamar Clark. We saw them remain silent. And we saw them in many ways reinforce the police narrative. So that is a hidden part of this. We saw the ketamine scandal that took place, where EMTs were saying that MPD officers were encouraging them to give people a date rape drug under circumstances in which it was often not warranted. And there hasn't been any real accountability for that, not from the medical profession or within the law enforcement community either. So the two work hand in hand. We've seen doctors come forward from Hennepin Health and other medical institutions and talk about the disproportionate levels of restraints and medication being used against African Americans and other people of color. And how, again, that ties into law enforcement training and their very close relationship with EMTs. So I wasn't surprised when I saw in the video the lackadaisical response that I felt. And some people might get offended by that and saying the EMTs did what they could. They were taking their sweet time when they walked up to George Floyd's body, and then they had to tap Derek Chauvin. They didn't say, man, get off of him, he can't breathe. They just tapped him on the shoulder like, okay, enough is enough. So that signaled to me that a lot of what happens is par for the course in terms of the mistreatment and dehumanization of Black people in their care. And of course, not in every case, but in far too many cases.
I'd throw in there training on excited delirium too. That's been hugely controversial. In fact, there's a petition by many of the employees at Hennepin Health that they want the Hennepin Health to stop training police officers on this excited delirium. And for those who don't know, excited delirium is something that the AMA, the American Medical Association, does not recognize as being an actual thing. Yet Hennepin Health is training EMTs and Minneapolis police officers on excited delirium. And if you listen to the Chauvin trial, what you heard there was this discussion of how they are told that if you have excited delirium, and it's troubling that we would be leaving it up to police officers to diagnose something that many doctors say doesn't exist, but that somebody who's experiencing that might suddenly exhibit superhuman strength. And you heard that over and over at the trial. And certainly if that's in your head or the head of a police officer, that is going to impact how you interact with that community member. So there's a lot that's controversial about that as well.
Well, thank you all so much for that robust discussion as well. We have on this topic of excited delirium, I just point folks to the series of videos that we've put out, and we did make a video on excited delirium that provides some really, I think, valuable information for folks. We've got less than 20 minutes left here. This time always goes by so quickly, and I wonder if we could just turn in our last time here together to talk about some of the recent events in our community. We've touched a little bit on some of this already. I wonder if we could just start by talking about the city's 2 attempts to take over George Floyd Square. What have been your perspectives on this, and what should the community be on the lookout for in the coming weeks?
So I guess I can start. I'm not surprised that the city is trying to reopen the streets near George Floyd Square. They were trying within the first few months after George Floyd was killed. And people emerged as caretakers of the square right from the beginning. And they've devoted a lot of time and energy to keeping the square as a sacred space and a memorial site in honor of George Floyd and other people who have lost their lives to police violence. It's really remarkable what they have been able to do within a year, and how many folks from here and around the world have visited George Floyd Square and found it to be a place of remembrance and solitude and solidarity. And then we know the flip side of the narrative as to why people want to reopen the streets, or some of the incidences that have happened within the vicinity of George Floyd Square, surrounding some of the crime that's taken place. And when you talk to the caretakers and the folks who support George Floyd Square remaining as a memorial site, they talk about the fact that crime was happening within the vicinity of George Floyd Square before George Floyd was killed. That this has been a part of the community in which the city has failed to invest. Many of the businesses surrounding George Floyd Square were not Black-owned businesses. And there was a great deal of economic injustice happening within the vicinity. We saw the cozy nature of the relationship between the Minneapolis police and the owners of Cup Foods, by how Lane walked into the store, got a $20 bill, didn't even know if it was fake or not, and then proceeded to abuse George Floyd when he pulled out the gun, as we talked about earlier, and treated him very aggressively. Those types of incidences in terms of the relationship, the sometimes fuzzy relationship between business owners and Minneapolis police, need to be examined as we have this conversation around, how do you bring some form of justice to a community that has experienced the kind of trauma that they witnessed and experienced, as well as the longstanding economic injustices, as well as the neglect that they've experienced by the city. They've also made George Floyd an autonomous zone, meaning they don't want police in the area. And of course, there's, in many people's eyes, pros and cons to that, but I can understand why they would take those steps in light of everything that has taken place in the last year.
And I'm really struck by the city's approach to the whole question of what to do with George Floyd Square, because their approach is to divide the community more than anything. And that's by hiring a private group, this Agape group, with hundreds of thousands of dollars in a potential contract to go in and as the city describes it, that's the community reopening the square, although they're organized, controlled, and funded by the city and coordinating with the city. And so it's a real attempt to divide the community, not to bring the different interests in Floyd's George Floyd Square together to discuss where to go from here, but rather to impose the city's vision and to try to do it through a community group, a community front group. I see it also in the response of law enforcement and our elected leadership to the continued protest activity. When among the murder of Dante Wright out in Brooklyn Center, we immediately see a response from law enforcement which tries to evoke in a certain percentage of the population that we have to have this level of fencing, security, riot police in order to prevent the property damage that happened last summer as part of this immense expression of community anger at the murder of George Floyd. And it's not to say that this protest community, that's what brought justice, and that's what got Derek Chauvin convicted. That's what got the 3 other officers charged. That's what's created this moment of reckoning in which we can actually confront our history as a nation and make changes. We should be giving awards, right? To the protest movement, not confronting them with fencing and armored vehicles. But that's a broader effort to divide the community and to create this fear of the increased crime rate. Even though crime rates are up in rural areas, they're up in cities where the police haven't been defunded or where they haven't all retired with claims of PTSD. And so there's this whole narrative I see in the Star Tribune, the business community talking about, the shootings that happened in downtown and how no one's being held accountable. Who's holding the business community accountable, of course. But there's this attempt to divide the community and to try to get us back, to try to restore and keep the status quo. And so I think, there's a complex situation in George Floyd Square, to go back to the original question. But we have to stand with the people there that are holding it down and making it a memorial space, and that made demands that went beyond just prosecuting Derek Chauvin as to when it would be appropriate to reopen the square or make final decisions about what should happen to it.
We had an earlier question about what kind of precedent did George Floyd set, and it makes me think about the fact that today the city and MPD took away barricades and other things that had been put up where people were protesting the shooting of Winston Smith. And one thing that has been really, really troubling about that is the complete lack of transparency in that case, the lack of accountability. Actually, Mayor Frey had a press conference today, and I believe it was the very first time he ever mentioned Winston Smith. But nobody has been speaking about this. And then you have nobody, like the sheriff, there's no information, and you have these dueling press releases from the BCA and the U.S. Attorney's Office saying they won't allow us to wear a body cam. And then the U.S. Attorney's Office said you've been allowed to wear it since October. And the public is all left in the dark. And told that there is no body cam video, which is absolutely astounding in this day and age. It is just not going to be okay for law enforcement to say, trust us anymore. And so we have the situation where people are protesting and holding space about, tell us what's going on here. And then a young woman is killed by somebody who drives through there. And I was watching some of the video when the police showed up after that. And one of the police officers said to one of the people videoing it, this wouldn't have happened if you weren't here. And so it's this constant cycle of the police kill Winston Smith, people are demanding accountability, transparency, and then they're looked at as though they're the problem. A young woman is killed, and now the people who are trying to hold space and get attention by saying, what's going on here? Nobody is really talking to us about this. And then the police come and haul their stuff away. It's really disappointing to see, after everything that happened with George Floyd, particularly the release that MPD had about the fact that he had suffered some kind of medical crisis during an interaction, that now we can't even get information, that they don't understand that information, transparency, and accountability is so critical if you are going to build any trust with the community.
The only thing I'd really add is that I think the episodes surrounding the attempts to reopen George Floyd Square, the things that are now happening in Uptown, the things that are happening as we talk here in Uptown, they continue to exemplify to me that the city of Minneapolis and the organs of law enforcement in the city, so that MPD, Hennepin County Sheriff's Department, their partners in crime, as it were, that they failed, I think, willingly and intentionally to learn anything from the past year and a half. They came out of last summer's uprising and the murder of George Floyd, having effectively learned that the way to deal with it is to ignore the demands of the community, to ignore the demands of the people who you are supposed to respond to and who elected you, theoretically. They learned that the best way to go forward is to remove people, to remove eyesores, to remove reminders of community healing and processing. And those are really the things they learned. And I think what we see at George Floyd Square, what we're seeing, as I said, even now in Uptown, where people continue to protest and hold space, is a reflection of that. That the city doesn't want people exercising their right to protest. It doesn't want people creating very public venues of conversation and discussion, especially when the conversation and discussion run counter to effectively what the city wants to do. And I think that's what you're seeing reflected at George Floyd Square and elsewhere, especially in Uptown these days.
I would agree with that. And I would just remind people that the first time that we witnessed the city coming in and trying to divide the community in the midst of an occupation was in the aftermath of Jamar Clark being killed. We had an 18-day occupation outside the 4th precinct. And the mayor at the time went and got Black community leaders and had them stand with her in a press conference and say that they wanted the occupation to end, that they wanted Plymouth Avenue to open back up, and they used the pollution from the fires that were lit in the street to keep us warm as the justification for why they wanted to get back to business and reopen Plymouth Avenue, knowing that they hadn't addressed any of the concerns surrounding their brutality that was flowing out of the 4th precinct, nor the failure to hold those officers accountable. So they came in the middle of the night with dump trucks and full force of the police to get us out of that occupation at the 4th precinct. And they had the same tactic with when Philando was killed and we were in front of the governor's mansion, which was a 21-day occupation. So it is remarkable that they've been able to hold that space for a year. And the government has tried, and the reason they didn't shut it down sooner was because they were concerned about armed conflict, that people were saying, if you try to come in here, we're going to fight back. And they did not want, the visibility of potential armed conflict happening in that situation. I personally think George Floyd Square should become a permanent memorial, that they should build up the businesses and make sure they're Black owned, that even the buildings around there are Black owned, and create home ownership opportunities for people who want to buy homes in that community. I think that's a start, along with the other demands that the organizers have put forward. I saw a question, Sarah, where someone was asking about an anonymous person, the difference between restorative justice and punishment, and why do I make a distinction? I believe in restorative justice, as you know, something we've talked about, something I've been involved in for many years. But I think it's premature to have that conversation in the context of Chauvin, as I articulated earlier. And in a lot of indigenous communities, restorative justice, in terms of making people whole, restoring the harm that you caused, could be used in lieu of sending someone into the criminal justice system who has committed harm. Sometimes it's used together, but most of the time, even in prison, people have restorative justice circles where they think about ways to restore harm even while they are serving their time in prison. So I just wanted to answer that in terms of someone's perception about the distinction.
Thank you, Nekima, for jumping in on that. And thank you all for this really powerful discussion. As always, the time just flies by. We are just a couple minutes before 7. And this is actually the last in our series of forums as it relates to Derek Chauvin's trial. So I just want to take a few minutes to share a little bit of information about how folks can stay connected and continue these dialogues about restorative practices and and other ways to be connected with the Legal Rights Center and with the work that's happening here. So, you know, we just really want to invite you to stay connected with us. If the trials for the other 3 officers go forward, we will be back in this space holding forum. But for right now, the first thing I want to share with you is that our Twin Cities legal support line will be activated as needed to support protest legal needs. And so that number is on your screen. I believe maybe not. It's 612-444-2654. And it's up on our website as well at the Legal Rights Center. I also wanted to let you know that tomorrow our staff and volunteers with the Legal Rights Center will be hanging out over at Lake Nokomis doing brief legal education presentations for people who are out there. We'll have cool treats and water so you can stop by to learn about your rights when interacting with law enforcement, and we'll be there from 3 to 4:30 in bright yellow shirts. And finally, as I mentioned, this will be the last of these forums for the foreseeable future, but moving forward, we're excited to create more space for community conversations on legal system transformation. So starting on July 1st, we'll be hosting community teach-ins. You'll hear 15 to 20 minutes about a particular topic from a community expert, and then spend the majority of the time in breakout rooms with community members discussing the issues, opportunities to change the system, and ways to get involved in the system change work. The first topic, we will be reimagining the justice system. The next week, we'll be discussing the role of judges in the legal system and how we hold them accountable. And week 3, we'll look at the history of the DOJ investigating MPD and what we can hope for the present investigation. So thank you all so much for being here tonight. Thank you so much to our panelists who are here with us, Bruce, Andrew, Mary, and Nekima, who have been with us throughout these forums. We hope you'll join us for these community teach-ins and for future forums as we come back together. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.